Good morning and welcome to On the Record with Buddy Cianci. My guest this morning, someone who's not a stranger to my radio show, nor a stranger to this program on Sunday mornings. He is a former head for a number of years, I think 30 years, of the Rhode Island Public Expenditure Council, was Revenue Commissioner for the state of Rhode Island, Director of Administration for the state of Rhode Island, and also right now he is the founding director of the Hassenfeld Institute for Public Leadership. Or for leadership in the state of Rhode Island. It's at Bryant University. And I wanted to check in with him because a lot of things have happened since the last time he was on our show. We're going to check in with him on the toll program. We're going to talk to him about the state pension and also what's the feasibility of and the effect of a statewide teacher contract. His name is Gary Sasse. Not unfamiliar to you. Gary Sasse, welcome again.
Thank you, buddy. Always good to be here.
My pleasure, and thanks for being here. Let's get down to the nitty-gritty. The one even though the legislature is not in session, we have all these different programs. Last week, on this show, I had the head of the Rhode Island Truckers Association, Chris Maxwell, and from his standpoint, they're no closer to agreement than they were a year ago or 8 months ago, whatever it was. And we're concerned, or people are concerned, because the roads are definitely in tough shape. Bridges are in tough shape. The governor has proposed a $1.1 billion, effectively a $1.1 billion tolling program. You've been on my radio show. You say we can do it cheaper with a little bit more thought. What is your plan? If you could wave a magic wand, what would be, knowing our bridges and roads are in tough shape, what's the SAS plan for efficiency and getting the biggest bang out of the buck?
Well, before I get to the SAS plan, there are two different issues. You know, one issue is how you fund it. And the governor's proposed tolls, the Republicans have proposed pay-as-you-go. You and I have talked about a hybrid plan, which includes a little bit of everything. And then the second issue is how do you finance it? And so the issue of how you fund it is a political decision. And we are nowhere on that political decision, because that political decision has to be predicated on at least an agreement among about the facts among the parties. The facts are how many trucks can use the roads.
Nobody knows that.
Well, how can you then put together a plan to collect tolls to fund a $500 million bond issue and not have clarity, at least agreement, on the number of trucks or close to agreement that'll be using the road? So before anything can happen, we have to reach that kind of an agreement. And we're going to look like fools if we go to the credit rating agencies and say, here's either a GO bond or a revenue bond.
General obligation.
Yeah, and it's predicated on truck usage of generating so much revenues, and the industry and the state can't agree. That's going to affect the saleability of those bonds.
Which affect how much we have to pay out in interest rates.
Exactly. So before we get into the weeds, let's be adults. Let's at least agree on what the potential revenue yields are, based on usage and truck usage. And the trucking industry and the state are miles apart. So that has to be resolved. The second issue, as I mentioned, is a funding issue. The governor thinks that we should fund it by tolls, and yet there are going to be 17 tolling gantries somewhere in the state. But no one's...
How do they come up with the 17 tolling gantries?
I don't know, and I don't think there's been a great deal of transparency on what the tolls are going to be, where the gantries will be located, and so that has to be resolved before you can put in place a tolling plan.
Don't they, Gary, not to interrupt you, but don't they want to pass the bonds first by the legislation, either a revenue or a GO, but the administration is not really into a GO bond, they're into revenues.
Yeah, and let me talk about the GO bond for a second.
Yeah.
Because...
but the second part is they do the bonds first, and then they do where the gantries are and how much the tolls are and all that. Isn't that kind of putting the cart before the horse?
And one of the reasons they may not like a GO bond is people have to vote to authorize a general obligation bond, because
they don't have to vote on a revenue bond, but they have to vote on a general obligation bond.
It's interesting, they're on the hook for either bond. If the revenues don't materialize, they have to pay both. And
so you might as well do the GO, because your interest rate is going to be lower than on a revenue bond.
Well, let me give you an example. We looked at a $150 million bond, and we compared
at another state.
Another state, right? Yeah. Another place, and we compared what the debt service would be on a revenue bond and a general obligation bond. And on a $150 million bond over
what was the difference?
$45 million. And so just think about...
That's a no-brainer.
Yeah, and the interest rate that we used on the general obligation bond was 3.25%, which was very conservative. versus a
Yeah.
5% revenue bond. So you can figure that out. There's no reason not to use a general obligation bond.
Can you use the revenue, even though it's not a revenue bond? Let's say they went to, and I think a general obligation bond would pass like that for roads and bridges.
We've done a poll. We know 76%
Yeah.
of the people favor that.
There you go. So that would pass. So if you could spend 3.25, as you say, Gary, right, as opposed to a revenue bond where you'd be paying 5 or in excess of 5, perhaps, because we don't have the history of collecting tolls. You could dedicate, as you told me on my radio show, you said you could take the general or the revenues from the tolls, if you had to toll, and obligate that money or earmark that money, that revenue, toward the payment of the general obligation bond, and you would get a hybrid so that you could get the interest rate for not half, but almost half of what it would cost to go out on a revenue bond.
Yeah, the general.
Why wouldn't we do that?
I don't know. The General Assembly, could authorize tolls. They could do as the truckers want, authorize increase in fees and diesel fuel taxes, and take that money and earmark it to a fund to pay off the general obligation bonds. That way you would be selling general obligation bonds. The debt service wouldn't be competing with other things the state has to spend money on or wants to spend money on, and you'd save a heck of a lot on interest. But to put it in really basic language, if you were paying less interest, your toll rates could be lower.
Right.
You could have fewer gantries, fewer tolling stations, or you could buy more repairs on your roads. And so simply to use an instrument where you're sending the money to rich Wall Street investors as opposed to fixing our bridges or having fewer tolls for trucks that drive through the state, if in fact we do toll, makes no sense at all. Now, the argument against using a general obligation bond, there are two arguments, I think. One argument is that we need the money up front.
The surge, I think they call it the surge. That you need the money right away to do all this stuff.
And I believe, and somebody can correct me, that you could have a special election to approve a general obligation bond. You don't have to wait to November to general election to do that. The second concern is that you might want to use general obligation bonding capacity in the future for other projects, and you can't. There's certain limits on.
Say that
debt.
again now.
You may want the opportunity to use general obligation bonds in the future for other projects.
Yeah.
And so if you use up your bonding capacity, you have less. But Rhode Island's been reasonably good. There are two benchmarks used. One is debt services as a percentage of the revenue you collect, and the second is debt.
This is to determine how much debt we really have per capita, or how much debt we have toward our gross product.
It determines how much debt we can afford.
Yeah.
And so we could afford to sell general obligation bonds and still not have used our capacity up, and so funds would be available.
Okay, so that's not a problem.
I don't think it is, but I cannot understand, why there's this lack of interest in a general obligation bond. If you can save $45 million.
Well, voters have to vote for it. That's what they're afraid of, and they think that you have to wait a long time. They have to go through a whole process of an election and all that.
You do have to go through an election, but it can be done. A special election can be held, and they've seen the same polling data that I've seen, because the polling data was developed by the Hasselfeld Institute. And what it showed, we asked the question, which public services do you think we spend too much on? Which public services do you think we spend too little on? And 76% of the people felt we didn't spend enough money on maintaining our roads and bridges.
Well, we might spend money, but the way we spend it is ineffectual in many ways. So that's a criticism DOT is lodged against DOT.
And that's another concern.
Right.
Unless you disclose and have total transparency on this project up front, you're really trusting DOT, and DOT's track record has not been great.
Now, there's a representative, Blake Filippi, who now has proposed, he's fearful that there would be, if the revenues didn't, under the governor's plan, if the revenues did not come in because there's a dispute as to how many trucks really use the roads, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, whether it's 11,000 or 4,000 18-wheelers or whatever, he says he wants to pass a piece of legislation that would absolutely prohibit tolls from being placed upon automobiles, which could be the next logical step. If they don't meet the revenues with trucks, they then would revert to to cars, and that's a possibility. Even though the governor says no, she's not going to do it. She's not going to be governor forever.
Well, but the interesting thing is, and this is I think there's a lack of logic in the governor's argument. She basically says by selling revenue bonds, the taxpayer won't be on the hook. And so then the question comes up, well,
I've
what...
heard that movie. I've seen that
Yeah.
movie before in
And the-
38 Studios.
and the question comes up, okay, what if we're not generating enough money through the tolls to service the bonds? Are you going to increase the tolls? And that's kind of a weird position to take, because if you're not generating money by lower rates, you're not going to generate more usage by higher rates.
And there's a diversion factor, too, because when Maxwell was here last week, sitting in that chair, he said, you don't understand the trucking industry. They will divert. They have GPSs. And if they don't have any drops in Rhode Island, they're going to go around Rhode Island, not coming through the state.
Well, their diversion, I think, is time is money to truckers like everyone else. And if they're on certain schedules and they save an hour or so by going through Rhode Island, they probably would go. Other trucks could divert because they're not on time pressure. But what's sad about this entire conversation is there's almost universal agreement in the state that we need to fix our roads and bridges. There's agreement we have to figure out a way to fund it, and it's not rocket scientists to reach an
What's the solution, Gary Sasse?
Well,
sit down and talk
the
and
solution
try to
is,
get
is
some...
probably a hybrid. You will need some debt, because you have to accumulate capital up front and get going. You could do some pay-as-you-go, as the Republicans recommend, by how we use our Rhode Island Capital Fund. I'll give you really a good one. Right now, we pay $12 million a year to pay the 38 Studios moral obligation bonds. That's going to end someday.
5 years from now,
a few years from now, we can just continue to divert that money, to pay
to pay off the general obligation bond.
Yeah, well, or to use some money for projects beyond to keep bonds down.
Sure.
So there are options. We need to get all parties to the table to discuss what is the fairest, the most efficient, and most economical way to do this. Because the real question is, we're going to fix the bridges, and let's try to do it in an economical, most cost-effective way possible.
All right, but there doesn't seem to be Mattiello, who seemed to be the voice of reason before, stopped this craziness of going ahead and tolling and not knowing how many trucks or where the trucks would be tolled and all that. It could be a combination of using a general obligation bond, having the voters approve it, be a much lower interest rate, and still tolling, but at a lesser rate, and we have to know where and how it all is happening.
Or if you didn't want to use tolls and you want to do what the trucker suggested by using
the increase in diesel fuel and every increased registration, it could be. I just don't think it's been vetted enough. I think there's been a lot of competition, but there hasn't been a sit-down as far as reasoning is concerned.
My impression of the discussion from all the sides, and it's really a pun, is it's either my way or the highway.
Yeah.
And there's plenty of room to reach a compromise, and to do it a hell of a lot cheaper, because what the governor's talking about is spending $1.1 billion for $500 million worth of bridges.
That doesn't make sense.
No.
That doesn't make sense when you have other alternatives. Okay, I think we've driven down the road of tolls long enough. Let's change the subject. I'm going to take a break, but we'll be right back with Gary Sasse, the founding director of the Hassenfeld Institute for Public Leadership, and we're going to talk about a statewide teacher contract, and we're going to talk a little bit about hedge funds in our pension system. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to On the Record with Buddy Cianci. My guest this morning, Gary Sasse, of the Rhode Island, of the Bryant University's Hassenfeld Institute of Public Leadership. We've done the tolls. Let's get into something that I think is just as important, because it involves money, and that's we're going to talk about two more topics. One is a statewide teacher contract, not strike, which was probably which would happen statewide if in fact we had
That's a real risk of this
Yeah,
thing.
exactly. And I also want to talk about the pension system with this hedge funds and the transparency with those. Rhode Island generated about 2.2% in its pension fund this year. Not a good record when you compare it with the median of the other pension systems around the country. We paid a huge number of dollars in fees, something 70, 80, maybe more $million. We have a fellow that the retired teachers have hired to come in as a forensic auditor. He's going to be in town November 18th, I believe, at the Crown Plaza Hotel. He's going to be talking about the hedge funds and all about and about how the pension system is really mismanaged. Now, the new treasurer has been in office for, well, since January, promised transparency, but nothing has really changed. Maybe there's been a little bit more transparency, maybe not. But these pension funds are still there. There has not been no movement with these hedge funds. They perform they haven't performed well at all. They have not been the kind of savior that people thought they were, and we still own them. And we're producing much less than the other pension systems around the country, and we're paying more in fees. What needs to be done there?
On the hedge funds, well, it's interesting. I'm going to
We've got a lot of money in hedge funds. We're paying big fees, 20% of the upside. I think it's 1 or 2% for the amount of money they manage. It's crazy. I mean, and if I were a pensioner, I'd be concerned. We should be concerned as Rhode Islanders, because if it doesn't make the actuarial assumption, we're going to have to make it up in taxpayer dollars.
Yeah, and what you defined is not just happening in Rhode Island, it's happening nationally. And a year ago, CalPERS...
Biggest pension fund, California pension fund, right? The
California
workers.
public employees, the workers out there. And they said they wanted to get out of the hedge fund investment. They found it too costly. They found it too complex. They found it not to be a viable way to invest the money. And what was surprising, everyone expected that CalPERS, which is an industry leader, when they took that position, other states would do the same thing. And there were a number of studies done. Utah, for example, the legislative auditor general in Utah did a study, and he asked the question, what if our asset allocation hadn't changed from
asset allocation meaning how much you put in hedge funds, how much you put in equities, how much you put in fixed income and all that. That's what they mean by allocation of all that money, billions of dollars. How do you put it in the stock market?
And what the Auditor General...
to get the return you need.
Yeah, and what the Auditor General in Utah found is that the pension fund, public pension fund in Utah would have about $1.3 billion more if they had stayed under the old system and not gone to hedge funds. There was another study that was sponsored by the American Federation of Teachers called "Everything That Glitters Is Not Gold," and they looked at 11 states, and they looked at, I think Rhode Island was included, though I have not read that study, but they looked at 11 states that used hedge funds, and they found out that in most cases they were expensive and the funds had not performed as well as they should have. And so that brings you to the question, why? Doesn't performance count? Because every study that I've read, suggests that the taxpayer and the pensioner is not being well served by some of these hedge funds. And the performance is not there. We have a track record now. I've quoted these studies. I can quote other studies about performance. And the only thing I can think of, two reasons, and they're political, because they're sure as heck not financial or economic. One is that people that are on state pension boards are not financial wizards.
No.
And they get snowed by some of these investment bankers, some of these bankers, some of these hedge fund managers that come in. And
some of it's political. Let's not forget that.
Oh, it's very political.
Right.
Because the second point is these guys contribute to campaigns.
Right.
I know here that some
through a third party sometimes and all that, but we know what happens.
In Rhode Island, hedge fund is paying for an economic development study
for the governor.
That's being done for the governor. So they're all kind of political alliances, and it's not.
And they contribute to the super PACs for the governor and the treasurer and all that stuff.
Oh, a lot of a lot of bundlers. I'm aware of them.
Bundlers. By the way, they're not raising $1,000. They're doing about $500,000 in one case, just donating it to the governor's PAC.
So there's a political factor.
And then they recommend a hedge fund, and then they hire the hedge fund, and we end up paying the high fees, and to the tune of one of the highest, if not the highest, but the second or third highest fee payer in the country. And we've got these hedge funds, and Warren Buffett said that the Standard & Poor's index would outperform hedge funds over a 10-year period any day, any decade you want to look at it, and he's apparently correct.
Well, but there, you want to balance risk. So if you're looking at an investment portfolio, you don't want to put all your eggs in, on an index approach. So there's some use for hedge funds, but the hedge funds have not performed. They've not been transparent. I think what your friend Ted Seidel, is talking about is that the hedge fund managers have done well, but taxpayers have done less well. They've been less transparent. So we need much tougher rules about when we use hedge funds and when we don't.
And the
use hedge
pension
funds.
fund has not grown as it should have. It's lost money. It lost $275 million in the past couple of months. Well, of course, the market's been down, but still we stay in these hedge funds that were brought in by Raimondo, and she hired all these hedge fund people, and they performed miserably. and the pension system has only performed at a 2.2% level, and that's what it's continuing at now.
But that was the last, this is the last
The
year.
last quarter,
This
or the,
quarter.
the last year, yeah. That's not a good record, and I know you have to look at it over a period of time, but still 2.2, we're not even with the median of what the pension systems around the country are doing. They're doing 3.4, 3.3,
Listen,
and we're doing 2.2. What you'd say it's only 1.2%. That's 1.2% of $8 billion. That's a lot of money.
No, and there's only one place, if the funds don't perform, we've already taken the flesh from the pensioners. We've had that reform. So
What can happen here, Mr. Sasse?
Well, a couple of things have to happen.
Where are the union leadership, I mean, who represent these pensioners? I haven't heard a peep out of them.
Well, just to the contrary, some of these employee groups are represented on the State Retirement Board.
Yeah.
So they do have a platform on which to raise some of these
Yeah.
issues. I can't,
I
tell
haven't
you.
heard them raise it, though.
I don't know what their thinking is or what their positions are, but I think it's a question of transparency in the use of these pension funds. I don't think this information is privileged. I think it has to be. I think the sunshine has to come in, and we need to debate this more closely.
And teachers, who have a big stake in this. I was doing a show at Barrington Books, which opened a new store at Garden City this week, and the general manager of Garden City came over, and I said, by the way, I remember when this thing was started years and years ago when I was a kid. I said, who owns this shopping mall now? It's a huge, Garden City. You know what it is?
That's great.
He said, I don't really know, but it's a teachers fund. A teachers union owns Garden City. That's what he told me. I mean, so they're not dumb people. They know how to invest money because that's a successful operation. No. And the guy who was on the show with me was the general manager. He used to be the general manager at the Providence Place Mall years ago. That's how I met him. And he was on my show this week. And I said, who owns, I used to own Flatley, used to own it, but they don't own it anymore. It's a two teachers pension fund that owns Garden City.
They own it or invested in it?
I think they're invested to the point where they own it.
Yeah,
yeah, right. Let's go on to something else now. And you'd think with that sophistication that they would know better.
Oh, I think they do know better because that report I mentioned.
And Marsha Rebeck is a wonderful woman, and she's on that pension. And I've seen her complain about this, but she's only one vote. So.
But also the AFT did.
And I want to get into to teachers' contracts.
One last thing, the AFT did the national study, which really raised questions on how the hedge funds were operating and whether both taxpayers and retired public workers were getting a fair shake on it. And so that did come from the unions. Your question is, why aren't the unions in Rhode Island raising some of the same concerns as unions outside of Rhode Island? That's the
Thank you. That's my question. Is they're too well connected with the treasurer and the political politics of it, and they're willing to let their union members, suffer. I mean, if I were a union member, which I used to be years ago when I was a kid, but I'm not any longer. And if I had a vested interest in that pension, and I guess we all do, because we're going to have to pay the difference if the money doesn't come through to supply that pension system with funds. I mean, where are they? I mean, I'd be screaming.
Well, they just went through a difficult struggle on fighting over changing the benefit.
But still, they're getting 2.2%. Come on. Let's get into something that we can talk about even with a little bit. I want to get into your national effort too, but I want to give a couple of minutes. There's been a proposal for a statewide teacher contract. Mm-hmm. What is the SAS take on statewide teacher contract? Good, bad, indifferent? Would it help? Would it reduce the cost of education in the future?
Well,
would it be unfair to one teacher to another, depending on the place where they teach?
I think it would be very problematic. The real question is, would a statewide teachers contract provide a better educational system for our kids, and would it provide an educational system at a cost property taxpayers could afford? And the answer to those questions is a resounding no. Let me give you a couple of examples why. When you negotiate a contract and you want to get certain reforms, you want to change programs, you want to change management, you have to negotiate. And the only tool you have to negotiate is money. Mm-hmm. And so to set a statewide teacher contract and say then the locals can negotiate programs and management creates absolutely zero incentives for the teachers to give anything on reforming, improving the structure. So it's a very skewed collective bargaining process. The other problem is, at what level do you set the statewide contract? What if you live in a district where the salary schedule now is below what the statewide contract would be? So your property taxes automatically increase to get to the statewide contract. Yeah. and then we have so many serious
And then you
education.
teach in the inner city in Providence, where you're bringing erasers and pencils and pads to the classroom at your own expense sometimes, as opposed to a richer school district where you're spending weekends on your student's father's yacht. I mean, it's a different deal. You know what I'm saying?
And we have to do. I think there are serious questions about how we compensate teachers, and there are serious issues about improving it. But how do you pay teachers that are in STEM programs, technology, science, and math?
Different from the philosopher kids.
How do you attract teachers to the most difficult teaching
Inner city environments. Yeah.
And so this is almost a one-size-fit-all. And in the national,
You don't think it's doable, do you, Gary? Sasse?
it's very doable, but it also hurt kids.
Okay.
And that's the bottom line, as
We
you
go-
would say.
Bottom line, you got that. Now we've got 1 minute left, and I want to ask you about. I wish we could get more. Maybe next time we'll do it on a. You can see Gary on my radio show every Wednesday, by the way, at 5 o'clock, or hear him, and you can see him too online. One last question. I know that, disclaimer, you are with the Marco Rubio campaign. He's had a great couple of weeks here. He's come up in the polls. He's riding number 3. What he did pretty well in the debate.
He did very well in the debate.
Yeah, he did very well in the debate. Tell me what's the next? What's in 30 seconds? What's the latest Rubio?
Just to
News.
so a lot of news, which I'm not going to disclose here,
Okay,
but to stay on message. What's really resonating is Marco now is getting out his message that the 21st century can be an American century. It's a message of reforming education. It's a message of a strong foreign policy. It's a measure of a tax program that treats everyone fairly, doubles the child's tax credit, and improves corporate tax
He's got
structure.
his leg in both the Tea Party and the traditional Republican Party, doesn't he?
Well, I think he's the most representative Republican in the ticket.
All right, Gary Sasse, thanks so much for watching, and thank you, Gary Sasse, for
pleasure.
being here. And we'll be back next week, but stay tuned for more great programming on ABC 6, your Southeast New England affiliate for ABC. Have a great afternoon.